Today's date is 3 February 2023. I'm in Oaksville, Virginia. I have the pleasure of speaking with Aaron Reddell. Thanks, Aaron, for sitting down and talking to us.
It's my pleasure.
If you could just give us a little bit of background on yourself. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up, go to school, things like that?
Sure. I was born in Everett, Washington, which is just north of Seattle, 1980, and shortly thereafter moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father was a chaplain in the U.S. Army. He had enlisted during Vietnam, became a chopper crew chief, and after he got out of the military, he followed his dream of becoming a priest, and after being a priest for a few years, kind of missed the military life, so decided to become a chaplain. Ended up in an engineer battalion at Fort Bragg, where he met a gentleman at a dinner party that offered him an opportunity to come and work with them at a unit that at the time was in its infancy, and it turned out that the gentleman he'd met was, at the time, Major Bucky Burris of 1st Special Forces Operation Detachment Delta. So that was the first few memories that I had were growing up on Fort Bragg in that type of company. And a few years later moved out back to the West Coast, back to the Seattle area. And my father continued his time in the military, I think in the reserves or National Guard. So frequent trips to Fort Lewis, Washington. So I kind of grew up as a military brat.
Gotcha. You were in which branch of the service?
So I enlisted in the Army National Guard as well.
Okay.
So I was in college, halfway through, got bored, decided I needed an adventure. So I thought, yeah, I'll put college on hold. I'll go enlist in the Guard, get my training, go back, and finish college. And I also liked, in Washington State, the National Guard was actually really active in counter-narcotics because of the Canadian border and search and rescue, which were all things that I was involved in as a Civil Air Patrol cadet, because I kind of knew my whole life I wanted to join the military. So left college and enlisted in the Army National Guard because I thought best of both worlds, get all the military stuff, also get to do the civil stuff, you know. And joke was on me because I ended up right back in college. They sent me to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California to study Arabic for about 2 years. Only now I wasn't allowed to skip class when it was sunny and nice outside. So yeah, that's what I get for letting a 20-year-old make my decisions for me.
Yeah.
So a couple years at Defense Language Institute, then on to AIT school at Fort Huachuca, Arizona for counterintelligence special agent. At the time was 97 Bravo. And as soon as I graduated and started and took leave essentially to transition back to my home unit, I received orders to deploy to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I had never met a single member of my National Guard unit face to face before I received orders to deploy for Iraqi Freedom. Because I enlisted in the year 2000.
Okay.
So I was at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, studying Arabic when 9/11 happened. So 6-something in the morning, wake up, one of my squad members was down the hall. He paid the extra money to have cable in his room and started yelling, hey, you know, a plane crashed into the Twin Towers, and all of us assumed it was like a Cessna or something. So ran down, started watching TV with him. Most everybody else was ignoring it because they were all trying to get ready to make formation on time. And he and I were standing next to each other when we saw the second plane hit the towers. And I mean, yeah, we knew what was going on at that point. So I was actually what was considered a floor sergeant at the time. I think I was like an E3, but if you wanted the position of leadership, basically leading the cleaning details and all the maintenance and stuff, you could get your own room because it was kind of a college campus atmosphere. So I addressed everybody in the hallway and said, stuff just got real, but until we hear from the chain of command, everybody get ready and report to formation because that's all we have to go on. So reported to formation that morning. Chain of command didn't really know what to do with everybody. At the time, the Defense Language Institute was an open campus. It was very much like a college campus. The local community could just sort of drive through the middle of the campus on their commute to work. So we all just went to class, and most of our teachers were from Egypt, and a couple of them were from Iraq, and so it was a very surreal day being there and getting all the different perspectives, both from us, all the soldiers, from soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines all mixed together in classes. Some of them from the East Coast, some of them we would find out later actually knew people that died in the attack on the Twin Towers. And then seeing the reactions of the teachers. We had some teachers that didn't come to work that day within the different schoolhouses. Some of the teachers were right there with us, mourning the attack on their new country, you know what I mean? The country they'd put their heart and souls into. And others, I remember one teacher was very affected by it, and she was just sobbing, and we're trying to console her. She was from Iraq, and she said, this is what it was like for us. We woke up one day, our country was on fire. And she said, I never would have wished this on anybody else, and I'm so sorry for you guys. But I still had, I think, a year to go or so in my language training. So, yeah, we just buckled down and rolled with the punches. They started instituting security measures on the base because, again, it was completely open. There weren't fences up, nothing. So here we were pulling guard duty with, reflective vests and orange cones and no weapons. So, yeah, I remember the little cards that were shout, show, shove, shoot. That was the directive. Give people directions. If they won't follow the directions, show them that you're armed. If they won't follow it, it was, or shout at them and then show them that you're armed and then shove them if you have to, and then you're authorized to shoot. I think there was like one rifle with one round in it available while we waited for federal police or something. So it was interesting to see. I sat back and I watched and took note of the command and control challenges that the chain of command was going through too. It would definitely serve me later on in my career. So.
Yeah. Did you recognize the gravity of that day and what it would mean, not only for you but for the country? I mean, everybody refers to this as our generation's Pearl Harbor. Changed the world.
Yes, I did, and so did my fellow classmates, because there are always, you have conversations, you suspect things, it's hard to test things out, but we could see, those of us that were there and observing it, even from as far away as the West Coast, it was instantly recognizable to most of us that this was a Pearl Harbor type event, what we'd later call a Black Swan event, something like that. We were pretty much all guaranteed that we were going to get to do the job that we'd signed up for. Yeah. A lot of us joined the military to test ourselves and serve in the military in a combative capacity, et cetera, and that was the confirmation. It was like, hey, we get our war. There's a lot of people that do an entire military career and never see conflict. Some of the other enlistees they did not take that information as well as others, because they were there for a purpose. A lot of them money for college, job training, etc. Not really considering the fact that an actual war would be in their future, or at least within their in their first enlistment. And so when you kind of divvy everything up into the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, I'd say probably 20% of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were kind of going, uh-oh, I might have, 80% of us were like, hey, we get to do the job, and 20% were like, oh no, we have to do the job now. Right. So, yeah, yeah, we could see the immediate effects. I mean, the grounded flights, the security at the airports. Many of us knew absolutely that our lives would be separated into before this and after this. There was everything before 9/11, and then there was going to be everything after 9/11. So.
Yeah. So you complete your training, you have another year left after 9/11.
Yeah, at
so
least.
Nothing changes for you as far as that goes. You still complete your training.
Still complete the training. The changes were minor. It was kind of playing catch up. So obviously the focus there is to learn the language, but then the feedback is coming down from higher commands of saying, hey, we're sending soldiers to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're struggling with these things, the ability to carry heavy loads, things like that. So now the chain of command is struggling with not only securing a base that was not secured before, and now having to treat it like a military installation, a more traditional military installation, but then it's the focus on the language with pressure from TRADOC and other chains of command to say they're still soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and they need to be as effective as possible once they leave, because it is like a college environment. There was no weapons qualification while you were there. There was common skills testing, so your first aid, land navigation, so the basic soldiering tasks you would get tested on, but not a lot of those core soldiering functions. So a lot of us kind of took it on ourselves to, on the weekends, we would go to supply on a Friday night, and we'd requisition rucksacks from supply, and over the weekend we'd go ruck marching on what was previously Fort Ord, California, to be as prepared as possible for when we graduated. And then I still had my advanced individual training school to look forward to after my language school. So once I finally completed language school, I was sent to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, to counterintelligence school. So again, there were still those challenges. We've got to make you counterintelligence agents, which is very heavily academically focused. It's not what we refer to as a hero school. You're not sliding out of helicopters. It's report writing and interviewing and investigations. And so it was on us to try to prepare ourselves as much as possible for the environment we knew we were going to. And it proved true, because like I said, I want to say it was less than 17 days from the time that I left AIT school to when I had deployment orders in my hand and was showing up to get ready to deploy to Iraq.
So I guess when you're you're learning Arabic,
mm-hmm.
There's probably zero doubt eventually where you're heading.
There was, however, and every branch can say this, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. And another good lesson, which it was one of those things that you always kind of knew in the back of your head, but then when you see it play out, it's that confirmation. When I hit the ground in Iraq, I ran into some fellow students from the Defense Language Institute, and all of them were Korean linguists. So Big Army somehow had sent the majority of the Arabic linguists that I graduated with to Germany, and a majority of the Korean linguists to Iraq. So in keeping in touch with a lot of the soldiers that I graduated Arabic with, saying, hey, where did you guys end up? And they're like, yeah, we're in Germany, requesting to be sent to Iraq, mm-hmm. and our requests are being denied, and they're sending all the Korean linguists, because nobody really reads, at least this is my theory. I've never been in personnel. My theory is nobody really reads the personnel jacket. It's just, you get a list of soldiers, you're a linguist, you go A, B, C. And I kind of experienced that when I was in Iraq. So yeah, that was typical military style. All the linguists I'd run into was like, hey, how you doing? Korean linguists. All the Arabic speaking linguists were in Germany, other parts of Europe, or Korea.
Right. What is counterintelligence?
So I often equate the counterintelligence field kind of like the medical field. It's incredibly broad. So most of the intelligence community they're gathering intelligence under a specific discipline or using specific electronic tool sets. Counterintelligence is also an intelligence gathering capability, but they have I guess one of their primary roles and the primary focus is to try to stop the dissemination or the leaking of intelligence, because obviously your adversaries are trying to gather intelligence on you. So your job is to try to prevent that. The basic level of it is through education and processes and procedures and audits and assessments. So when you see the posters, loose lips sink ships and things like that, that's very much born out of the counterintelligence discipline, is educating soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that, yeah, loose lips sink ships. Don't be telling people where you're going. Don't give a lot of details. If people are asking you a lot of details about what you're doing, you're combating the insider threat and the inside the wire threat. You're trying to combat social engineering, trying to keep people from running their mouths when they're out at the bar, or trying to impress people, because some of those people might actively be trying to collect information. So that's the foundation of the discipline, but then kind of like the medical field, it starts to compartmentalize from there. So we obviously put a lot of emphasis on trying to keep information from being leaked, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And then there's also what we refer to as kind of the spy catcher side, where you're actively engaging in operations and investigations. So there's an investigation aspect when it comes to espionage, counterterrorism, things like that. And then there's the intelligence gathering, which is source operations. You're going out and you're looking for people either in the local population or within the adversary's ranks who are willing to share information with you. So a lot of different disciplines and then specialties within those disciplines. So you kind of have your spies, your spy catchers, your spy recruiters, with the foundation being the boring side, which is giving briefings on information safety and also doing audits and assessments to make sure that people are keeping logs of who's signing out classified and signing it back in, and do the storage drawers meet the specifications that they need to store different levels of classification. So there's no such thing as high speed. For all the really cool, sexy stuff, there's a lot of mundane work that's got to go in behind it. So it kind of runs the gamut. And I got to do a little bit of everything in my time, so I was lucky.
So when do you deploy to Iraq? What year?
So that was 2004. I'm pretty sure early 2004. Deployed to Iraq with the 341st Military Intelligence Battalion out of Tacoma, Washington, Fort Lewis, with a team of, I think there were about 8 of us maybe, captain, lieutenant, sergeant, and a few of us lower enlisted guys. So trained up in Texas. While we were training in Texas to deploy and qualifying on everything, they sent us to Fort Huachuca for another like 4-day training scenario kind of thing. And while we were there, our group specifically, everybody else went back to Texas and then deployed. Our group stayed behind for advanced training in source operations, basically how to recruit sources of information and manage them, and the funding and all the ins and outs of it. So when we got back to Texas, the main group had already deployed, and we were a few weeks behind them. So we had to catch a ride with, I think, a group from the 82nd Airborne or something. Got into Baghdad and, didn't know what to expect. Got off the runway in the middle of the night, and, I think like a lot of people, we're like, hey, we don't have any ammunition. We don't know if we're going to be under fire. What, we're downtown Baghdad, and got bussed over in the dark to BIOP, what was one of Saddam Hussein's palace facilities right outside the airport. Brought into this giant like warehouse basically with our duffel bags and told, find a bunk. And in typical military fashion, it was a lot of hurry up and wait, a lot of roomment flying around, where we're getting sent, all this stuff, nothing official. For the next, I think, 3 or 4 days, we were basically just there in this warehouse, taking a little shuttle to and from Chow, waiting for orders to go somewhere. And then we were all divided up and scattered to the 4 winds, because we were just supplementing other units. Yeah. So everybody got split up. I actually ended up remaining on BIOP for the next couple of months, basically working at headquarters for what had been an ELINT battalion, an electronics information gathering battalion focused on primarily like Korea, Southeast Asia theater, and essentially Big Army, because of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, said, you guys are now a human intelligence battalion. Okay. So they all had to get retrained and kind of figure out how to do that job. So that presented a lot of challenges as well. And then, you've heard the stories as the cooks assigned to the battalion, a lot of other people ended up doing convoy security and whatnot. And because they were new to human, they didn't really know what to do with us either, because human intelligence and especially counterintelligence kind of fits into this special category where they didn't know whether to allow us to be plainclothes or not. We weren't allowed to be on any what we called housekeeping duty rosters. Everybody's got to do their time cleaning the latrines and stuff. And we've got all these special little carve outs, and then we had exemptions for leaving the bases. At the time, the rules of engagement are changing daily, and the rules for how large of an element you had to have in order to leave the main base, it would change almost daily. So it'd be like, you need a minimum of 3 Humvees with 4 people per Humvee, et cetera. And then it became, counterintelligence has an exemption, so they can go out in 1 vehicle with only 3 at a minimum. And then it was, no, they need security, but security can't be other counterintelligence or other intelligence people. It needs to be combat arms. It needs to be infantry or something. But then there weren't any to go around. And how do you go to another unit and say, I need 5 infantry soldiers who now belong to us, So yeah, it was a little crazy the first few months being there while everybody figured out just how to get stuff done. And then the chain of command forgot that I spoke Arabic, so I kept having to kind of remind them. And then they started attaching me to all kinds of different units. So I spent a little bit of time in Baghdad, kind of working at a more strategic level of intelligence collection, more looking at large geographical areas, theater-wide type stuff. And then they said, hey, 1st Cavalry Division needs an Arabic linguist. So they grabbed me, put me on the back of a truck, sent me out into literally the middle of the desert in between Baghdad and Ramadi to a truck stop that had been converted to a temporary detention facility. And I worked with the 1st Cavalry Division. That was after being temporarily assigned to, I think, 18th Airborne Corps to help them both on counterintelligence and as a linguist. And then every once in a while, somebody would come in and say, hey, we need somebody to run an investigation because we think somebody's selling equipment that got left behind to the local populace or something like that,
Right.
or we caught these third country nationals taking video of the helicopters coming in and going out. So I was wearing as many hats as you could as a counterintelligence agent. And I think by the time I got to 1st Cav, I had helped out in some operations. They had kind of done an activity surge in the area. So the infantry was going out trying to round up bad people. They'd been catching a lot of guys setting out strings of IEDs and stuff, and so there were a lot of tactical field interviews going on kind of in the middle of the night during the operation, and then there was stuff going on at the detention facility. The name of the operation's listed on my ARCOM. I should have looked it up so I could list it by name, but I got an Army Commendation Medal for my participation. But I remember the 1st Sergeant, 1st Cavalry Division was like, hey soldier, you did a lot of good work for us. We're going to send you back. Who do I list on the orders or something? And I was like, 1st Sergeant, I don't know. I'm like, whether you want to pat me on the back or kick me in the ass, I don't know who I belong to right now. So I just fill it out the best you can. And eventually ended up back in Baghdad before they sent me actually back to the United States to give a briefing and participate in the AUSA conference, which I'd never heard of. So my 1st Sergeant came in and was like, hey, we're sending you to Washington, D.C. And I was like, when? He said, right now. And all I had on was, a desert camo uniform that I hadn't washed in like a week. And he said, yeah, you're going to go to D.C., you're going to meet with this group and give them a briefing on this stuff that we've been doing. And then there's this AUSA association in the United States Army or Armed Forces or something. There's an annual conference. So you need your Class B, your greens, dress up. And get that truck's leaving for Kuwait right now, so be on it. So I'm literally calling around trying to find somebody that I know that lives in the DC area that I can have my uniform sent to get pressed so that I'll have something to wear other than my fatigues. But got on the plane back to the US, got off the plane at Dulles Airport, smelling like God knows what in dirty desert camos right out of the field. Walk off the plane at Dulles Airport and literally had to walk up to the bank of telephones and hotels and rental cars and just, can I get a rental car? Can I get a hotel? Had no idea where to go or what to do. And after 2 weeks of that, little taste of home in DC, back on the plane back to Iraq, and then assigned to Al-Qut, which is in central province of Iraq. Under 5th Special Forces, and then I can't remember who replaced them while I was there, 7th Group, I think. Yeah, and during that time got to see the ruins of Babylon in Al-Hilla, and just, yeah, absolutely beautiful. My dad was a Vietnam veteran. I remember sending him pictures of the rivers and the riverbanks in Al-Hilla, just green, tall grasses, palm trees everywhere, and he was like, it looks like Vietnam. And I remember all the communities that were built along the rivers, they had these beautiful river walks, boxing rings, little zoos and playgrounds and stuff. Absolutely beautiful country. If it was a little bit safer, I'd go back in a heartbeat and visit. I had a great time there. And it didn't hurt being able to speak the language and being able to converse with the locals, so.
You said earlier that you never know what to expect when you get deployed, especially in the combat zone. Your dad had been deployed, right?
Yes.
Did he give you any advice before you went over?
He did. He said, "Don't hesitate." That was it. Um, he had only shared a couple of stories from his time in Vietnam. He had a similar wild ride that I think you've heard from a lot of people. He enlisted to be a chopper crew chief. They screwed up his orders and sent him to infantry school. While he was in infantry school, his instructors were like, "Hey, you're not too stupid, and we're short on officers, so we're going to send you to OCS." So he got, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks into OCS, and they're like, "Well, you don't even have a single credit of college. What are you doing here?" And he was like, "That's where they told me to come." So they put him on a boat bound for Vietnam with helicopters, and then fighting broke out in Israel, so they turned the boat, and then that stopped while they were on their way, so they turned the boat back, and he got to Vietnam, and while he was there got shot down several times. And during one major offensive they said, "It's all air crew here. Does anybody have any additional training?" And he was stupid enough to raise his hand and say, "Yeah, I'm infantry qualified." So then his job for the next several weeks was leading patrols around the base, and yeah, so that's, there is no typical A to B to C kind of career path in the military. So he shared a few stories with me, and that was basically it. Is he was, I think like a lot of veterans had a couple of the stories of being overrun and things going all the way to hand, no ammo, no nothing. And he said some days survival comes down to who's the bigger savage. And so there's nothing that can prepare you for it. And that was true. I heard both my grandfathers were still alive, both World War II vets, when I enlisted, and my uncle, Korean War vet. Everybody I knew was giving me advice, and it was all welcomed and appreciated. But it doesn't matter how many times you watch the movie Full Metal Jacket, until you're standing there with that person yelling in your face, and there's not much you can do to prepare for it. So yeah, that was the big thing, is don't hesitate.
What are the Iraqi people like that you interacted with?
So in my opinion, that was actually, I remember, I got to go on leave. So not just the DC trip, but I actually got to go back to Washington State on leave in the summertime. And not everybody in the unit got to go. So you had to maintain a certain amount of readiness. So it was really just luck of the draw. And I was lucky enough to get to take my 2 weeks of leave or whatever. So went back to Washington State in the middle of summer, left Iraq, it was 125 degrees. Got to Washington State, it was 75, and everybody's in shorts and t-shirts, and I'm in a sweater, because to me it felt cold. And sat down, talked to my family, and they, that was actually one of the first questions that people would ask. There were 2 questions people would ask. When are we going to win the war in Iraq? And what is it like? And my 2 responses were, when is the NYPD going to solve crime in New York? As long as the people have an ounce of resistance in them, conflicts like that are never going to end. Because every day, even unintentionally, you create more adversaries. And my other response, what's Iraq like? What are the Iraqi people like? It's like California. It's about the same size and about the same population. Most of it's hot and dry, and then there's some pretty country in the mountains, and the people are very similar. Big city people are like big city people. They grow up, they go to mosque on holidays, it's kind of part of the culture. There's actually, unbeknownst to a lot of people, there's actually a very significant Christian population in Iraq as well, very active, a lot of old churches, a lot of biblical history there. And the city people are more modern thinking. They enjoy the nightlife and the arts and and I guess what you would consider sort of more liberal thinking, you know, more progressive thinking. And then the country people are like country people. You know, they're a little bit more old-fashioned, more conservative. They're mistrusting of outsiders, and you know, there's more tribalism to it. You know what I mean? So, yeah, to me, other than the language barriers and some other cultural differences, you know, like if you know, not crossing your legs and showing people the bottom of your feet when you're talking to them, different things like that. With short of some of those minor nuances, being in Iraq was a lot like being in California.
So you've got a culture that's all the way around the world, opposite from California. Both cultures are foreign to each other,
Yep.
to some degree, and yet the people are pretty much the same. The average guy, when you drill it down, is the average guy.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, you know, the hopes and dreams are very similar. Everybody's trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. Everybody's trying to make life better for themselves, their kids. And some people see the value. Yeah, I mean, you name it. I saw it interacting with them because it was my job to go and talk to people and to kind of find out their motivations for why they might want to help us and not want to help whatever the local group was that was threatening U.S. interests. You know, we always, on the news, we always looked at things as, you know, the army or the insurgency or whatever, and it was, in my experience, it was not a singular coordinated effort, not even close. It was tribal and it was regional. And what my experience was is the majority of the people that were fighting Americans and causing deaths and injuries were not fighting for Iraq. They were fighting for their area. They were fighting for their province or their city or even their section of that city. So it was not like, I guess it was unlike Vietnam in that way. It was more like the gang wars of the 1920s, where when I was in Al Qut in Wasat province, the person who was the biggest threat to U.S. forces and U.S. interests at the time was more like the Al Capone of that area, and there was infighting. So, you know, we'd be on our compound at night trying to enjoy some rest and some downtime, and we would hear gunfights and see gunfights and explosions in the city, and that was criminal elements fighting each other. So they would fight each other to become the Al Capone of that city or that province, you know, at whatever level. And if Americans got in the way, they would fight us too. You know, so there was a lot of the enemy of my enemy is my friend going on. So you would have temporary allies. You talk to one group that had attacked you last week, and this week they're your friends because they want to give you the opportunity to take down their rivals. And if you do help them take down their rivals, then next week they're gonna try to blow you up again because it's no longer in their interest. So it was, yeah, it was a lot of localized threat, not widespread.
The average Iraqis that you're talking to, trying to gather intelligence, are they willing to give it? Are they cooperative at this point, early on in the war?
Unfortunately, yes, and yes and no. It's just like anything else. And again, it's just like being in California. Everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame. So you would talk to some people, and they were just over the moon that they were getting to talk to an American, you know, and especially one that they could understand and could understand them. And to understand from their perspective, the way that I was trained to speak Arabic would be like someone speaking Elizabethan English. So I'm sitting there talking to them, and it sounds like I'm reciting Shakespeare, essentially, you know, so they got a kick out of that. But you know, you would talk to just about anybody on the street that was willing to talk to you, and they wanted to ask all kinds of questions. Does our body armor keep us cool? You know, they thought that they were cooling vests, you know, and I'm like, no, I wish. They would ask questions about our culture, about our popular media, all kinds of stuff, you know. They wanted to engage. They wanted to practice their English, you know. A lot of them wanted to find common ground. The people that knew information and had their interests, if they didn't want to share it, they weren't going to share it. There was an us versus them mentality with a lot of people. You know, some of my sources of information that were actually willing to share important information with me would be honest and say, you know, I don't support you guys, but I'm not religious, so I'm not helping this group who is on a religious quest.
Right.
I think that they're doing us a disservice. So I'm against what they're trying to accomplish. I don't like you, but I'll help you because you're better than what they're trying to do. I always tried to seek out people where I kind of knew where they stood. So I worked a lot with doctors, and because doctors had a common ground. Doctors hated getting more patients, especially now that they didn't have the resources to take care of them. So I worked with a few doctors that they didn't like the fact that our presence kept resulting in more patients in their hospitals, and they didn't like the fact that the local malicious activities were causing more patients in their hospitals. Some people definitely wanted to work with us. They had been members of the government or whatnot, and they could see the potential. They knew what the opportunity was for the U.S. to be successful. And so they were very willing to make that happen. A lot of them loved their country, did not like the leadership, because they felt like Saddam had kind of kept them stuck in the 70s, essentially.
Okay.
So again, a lot of your, I guess, higher society individuals knew the potential and were denied access to technology, to progress, to education coming from Europe and the United States and things, and they wanted that. They wanted to be able to bring those things back to Iraq because they knew that Iraq could be a more modern, more Western country like the UAE or Jordan or something. You know, they wanted that for the people. So, but I mean, I talked to a few people who were like, "Hey, we didn't like Saddam, but we had food, we had clean water, we had supplies, and right now we don't because of the status of the war." You know. So the engineers in Wasip province one year, who knows how many millions of dollars it took. They put up all these phone towers, you know, strung phone lines, and then people came in behind them and knocked them down and chopped them up and sold them for scrap metal. So it was basically, they kind of skipped hardline telephone service and went straight to just mobile telephone service. You know, so you'd see these almost evolutionary leaps within society there. As, you know, went from, hey, we need to bring more telephone service to the community, was like, well, that's not a reality. So we're just going to go straight over to to Wi-Fi and, you know, and cell service. So, yeah, it was interesting to observe.
Were you ever involved in firefight or anything like that?
Yeah, a couple from a distance. First one I was ever in was from the back of a truck, and we were driving through an area. There was a guy on a roof, and we were pretty sure he was the one shooting at us, and everybody started shooting at him, and he disappeared. And there were like 9 of us shooting at him, and so anybody who's claiming like, oh yeah, I totally hit that guy, I don't think any of us hit him. Because it was the first for all of us, you know. It was, and then a lot of them were over before they began. So, you know, you're driving down a road and an RPG goes flying by. You're driving down a road and people start shooting at you. And in my experience, knock on wood, I was very lucky. I walked out without a scratch. there was nothing protracted. We never got bogged down, you know. In Iraq, it wasn't until Afghanistan. So even the more direct action stuff with some of the units that I was assigned to, we were kind of going house to house. The infantry guys that I was working with they were on top of anything before I could even react, you know. So it was something you started to get used to and get a little bit quicker at, the more that it happened. But yeah, my hat's off to like the 1st Cav guys and 18th Airborne Corps guys. I mean, you'd be rolling into an area and they'd be fast asleep in the back of the vehicle, and as soon as the vehicle stopped, they were wide awake, closing everything up, out the door, and something would pop off and they were already returning rounds before I could even get my gun up. So, it wasn't until I was in Afghanistan that I was in some more gunsy situations that lasted a little bit longer. Yeah.
How long are you in Iraq?
Full year, actually a year plus. So I remember we were all joking when we first got our orders to deploy, because, you know, as everybody knew, you got to do a year, and all of our orders said 565 days. So that's what the order said. So we're like, well, shoot, I guess we're in it for 500 to 565. But I think I ended up being there about 13, almost 14 months in total, which I was okay with, because I'd basically gotten to go on leave twice, you know.
Yeah.
And actually, when I was there, I actually requested to extend. I enjoyed what I was doing. I felt like what I was doing was making an impact. And I went to my chain of command toward the end of my first tour and said, I'll do another 6 months, no problem. I got nothing else going on back home, just going back to college, which I wasn't really excited to do anyway. But because I was attached and a detailee and all this stuff, it was basically, they'd have to get permission from echelons above God in Washington State in order to extend me for 6 months. So then I was like, you know what? Now I wish I'd just gone active duty, because I basically, from the time I rose my hand and left for basic training, I spent 4 years on active duty.
Right.
Never met a single person from my National Guard unit. Finally got back to the States after my 14 months deployed, and finally met people from my unit, and then I helped set up a training. So part of the 2 weeks of summer training, it was, hey, a lot of the marksmanship stuff that they're teaching is not applicable over there. It's still very much, 300 yards, Cold War style, so a lot of what we were doing was a lot closer in, even as slow as I could move, you know what I mean? And so we basically developed some training that the Special Forces detachment that I was assigned to in Al-Qut, and the Marine Anglico that was working with us. So when I went to Al-Qut, we were on a Ukrainian base. Ukrainian military controlled it. It was an old Iraqi Air Force base. And the only Americans on the base were a small detachment of civil affairs officers, a Marine Anglico unit who are also reserves, and the Special Forces detachment. So we lived on this tiny little compound that had been the Iraqi Air Force officers' housing, essentially, with Kurdish guards and support. And so we all helped each other on our missions and operations. So they would take us, because it was extra linguist capability and intelligence capability. Civil affairs would say, hey, we need the extra bodies for security, for language, for everything. So civil affairs say, hey, we got a mission, can you guys come with us? Sure. So counter intel and special forces, here we go, we're going on the civil affairs mission. And then the next day it'd be SF would have a mission, be like, can you guys come with us? Sure. So counter intel, civil affairs, and then we'd raise our hand and be like, hey, we know we're the lowest on the totem pole, but we're going to meet with this important guy. Are you guys doing anything? Nope. Sure. There we go. So, so here we are leading the charge with SF and civil affairs with us, and but yeah, and rightly so. Loved working with them. The SF guys were like, hey, we're not working with you guys unless we know you have a basic level of competence, so that you're not going to get yourselves or us hurt or something when we're out and about. So we did some training on the compound. A lot of the houses were empty, so we used those for CQB training. And once they had us to a level of competency where they were not worried about us, then we started working together. So I was able to take some of that back to the unit in Washington State and say, this is what right looks like for what I was doing, and these guys say this is what right looks like. So set up some training, and then yeah, I think I went to maybe 2 or 3 drills with my unit, and then moved to the East Coast for a job. And while I was doing that job, and still a National Guardsman, so I was a Sergeant E5 at this point in the National Guard, I still had to do my weekend drills and my 2 weeks of AT, but at that time I was a contractor going back and forth overseas, and then in one of those deployments I was recruited into the Stable Shadow program, which was not a very well-known program. It was essentially the government's ability to say, we have some qualified, experienced, and needed civilian contractors. We need them to do certain jobs that they can't do as civilians, so they have to become government. So essentially they make you a GS-13 Step 10 overnight under the Department of the Army. So my orders literally came from the Pentagon. And I was in Afghanistan at the time. They flew me back here to Washington, D.C. to essentially swear me in, give me my government credentials, all that kind of stuff, and then flew me right back to Afghanistan to lead human intelligence collection operations for the Afghanistan theater for NATO and ISAF. So I found myself in charge of all the human intelligence collectors, so counter intel people, human intel people, for NATO and ISAF forces who didn't speak English as a first language. So none of the Five Eyes nations. So the people I had working under me were Romanians, Bulgarians, Italians, Turks, Greeks, Portuguese, I mean, you name it, Slovaks. Yeah, that presented its own set of challenges. So
So you're in charge of all those countries that don't speak, that English isn't their native language. So how does that
yes.
work? What's the mission, I guess? Let's go with that.
So just like the U.S. mission, right? These are assets, the coalition of the willing. So NATO and ISAF forces are doing the same thing that the U.S. is doing. In Afghanistan, different countries had different bases scattered throughout the country. So at the time, the Italians were in charge of the base in Herat. And then different countries had different bases around the country as well. So essentially it was at the strategic level, we're gathering human intelligence for the entire country through these NATO and ISAF forces. So they're the U.S. equivalent of our counterintelligence. They're doing the same thing, just with the nuances that what they think right looks like based on their training from their country, which was more challenging with some of the formerly Eastern Bloc countries like Romania, Bulgaria, countries like that, because Russia had managed most of that. So their military standalone had not had a history of that capability. So one of my staff members was a former Romanian colonel in the Romanian Airborne, who, when Romania got its independence after the fall of communism, they basically said, you need to start a counterintelligence capability, because they had literally not been allowed to under Russia. So it was new for some of the countries. Some of the countries were very good at it. Belgium had some incredible collectors. Their reporting style had created some challenges. I didn't disagree with it in theory. They were basically like, hey, whatever anybody says is exactly what we write and exactly how we record it. You know, so there's no nuance, there's no translation, which made it hard to digest as an intelligence product. It was hard to read what's essentially just a verbatim transcript, you know. So we had some challenges, you know. A lot of the people that were working with me were colonels and above from their respective countries, and in some of those countries, that's like being a celebrity. You know, I mean, you make colonel or general, and you don't pay for drinks at the bar, you don't pay for taxis. You know, I mean, you're treated well. The U.S. doesn't have the same culture, both militarily and government. You know, yeah, we have generals, but we have different levels of generals. You know? And colonels are a dime a dozen. You know, so that was difficult to be that bridge between those different groups. At first, overcome the interpersonal problems that we had with the different countries, because I had guys that I worked with who I loved working with, some of the finest military professionals in the world, literally. When they were lieutenants, they were training to kill each other on different sides of the Cold War. And now they're colonels or above, and they're supposed to be working together. And I literally had Greeks and Turks on the same team working through challenges. And then I had to translate all of that, both in the intelligence products, but also culturally, to the U.S. chain of command, and help them understand the challenges and the nuances that we were dealing with. I had one conversation with one of the leaders on the U.S. side, because he was incredibly frustrated with one of my Romanian intelligence gatherers. He was kind of the leader of his group, and I finally had to have the conversation, because he was putting phrases into his reports that used to be in common usage here in the U.S. Latin and French were more common in the daily vernacular years ago here in the U.S. It was frustrating some of the analysts on the other side. And so there were a few heated conversations, and I had to say, sir, we'll do a better job of QAing and QCing so it's more digestible for you guys, but you have to understand, this Romanian colonel, English is his fifth language. He's more fluent in Chinese than he is in English. And he's a nuclear physicist, and he's studied at Oxford and the Sorbonne. Like, he's literally smarter than both of us put together. And we got some headway after that. When I took over the office, I think that the reporting that was being generated from all these different contributing nations was making up less than 8% of the total finished intelligence products that were coming out of the Kabul-based cluster at the time. And within about 6 months, we'd grown that. It was on its way to over 20% of the used intelligence products. So we were able to refine a lot of the collection efforts and get everybody in the same boat, rowing in the same direction with minimal standards. It was good, and overcoming the challenges of the environment in Afghanistan. So, like I said, things got pretty gunsy. There were a couple of attacks on the Kabul-based cluster, one of which I ended up outside the wire, in a more traditional gunfight, I guess, to try to get teams back into the wire to safety, because all the bases were locking down gates, and we literally had teams on the radio going from base to base, literally knocking on the door saying, please let us in. Eventually we were able to get everybody locked down for the night on the inside of the gates. And then there was another incident similar. It was a protracted attack on the U.S. Embassy and ISAF headquarters, which were across the street from each other. I think it lasted like 20 hours in totality. And that's when we saw an uptick in the inside the wire attacks. So you saw, this was around 2010, you saw this big upswing in Afghans in police or military uniforms standing their post and then turning on the local forces. And so my office worked with Allied Command Counterintelligence to start a CI surge, essentially, and start re-interviewing, going back over backgrounds, some things like that, and we saw a drastic dip. So it was one of the best assignments that I could have had. Is the way I like to describe it for those military that at least had the 80s and 90s MREs. You either got a good entree and a bad dessert, or a good dessert and a bad entree. You can never get both at the same time. And the military, it's like you've either got this amazing base and this terrible chain of command, or you got this awesome chain of command, but the base you're at you hate. And when I was in Afghanistan, and again, I was still having to do like my weekend drill time to get credit for it, which essentially I would just have the colonel that I was assigned under. I'd go to him with this paperwork and be like, hey boss, the last 3 days was my drill time, for my National Guard drill points kind of thing. And so he'd sign that. Yeah, I had a great proactive chain of command that supported everything we were doing. Great crew working for me. I mean, there's Romanian and German and Canadian analysts, just incredible professionals, incredibly experienced, and yeah, that was definitely the high point of my career. And when I left and finished my enlistment, everybody I knew, their units were all trying to do everything they could to keep them. Retention is always a huge thing. I think I had only been face to face with the people from my National Guard unit 3 times. And so when it finally came time, in active ready reserve, all the time was completely done, and they were like, okay, yeah, you're free and clear. I was like, well, do you guys want to offer me like a cool school or something to keep me? And they were like, nope. They're like, we cut the lock off your wall locker and inventoried your stuff, and you're out. I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm done then. So, yeah, I enlisted and never saw anybody from my unit. Couldn't pick any of them out of a lineup. Barely spent a day there.
Interesting. How does Iraq and Afghanistan differ from each other?
I don't know, because I don't want to offend anybody. So this is we're on the border with West Virginia. I spend a lot of time over there. I know some people from there. So this is said with the most heartfelt, like, bless your heart that I can. But I think in order to put it in terms that I think people could relate to in general, okay? Again, not disparaging anyone. They're all my fellow countrymen, but I think if you kind of relate what people's perception of the difference between California and West Virginia would be, if that makes sense. Again, very tribal and communal based, very
modern.
Not as modern, geographically harder to navigate, harder to survive. There's a broader difference in the actual landscape. I mean, just arid desert portions of, well, Iraq, but also Afghanistan. Some just incredible, beautiful mountainous regions of Afghanistan. And I was fortunate enough to travel all over the entire country of Afghanistan. And so I got to see everything, the Minaret of Jam, the first national park, the mountain regions, the lowlands, the rivers in Jalalabad, just everything. But yeah, I think culturally, again, you have your big city people, obviously, but then everybody's very geographically dispersed, very tribal, and mistrusting of authorities and outsiders and things. And it was very interesting that, again, the sense of nationalism in Iraq was kind of like California. It's like, well, yeah, we're Americans, but we're Californians. You know what I mean? So there wasn't a sense of Arab nationalism in Iraq. It was more, yeah, we're Iraqi, but because of the different regions, there was a little bit of kind of esprit de corps, like we see here in the U.S., where it's like, well, we're northern Iraqis and those are southern Iraqis, or the Baghdad Iraqis, etc. And Afghanistan, I remember one of my interpreters explaining to me, he's like, you don't understand, most people can trace their tribal lineage 18 generations at a minimum. Like, that's standard. A lot of people 25 generations, and all the intermingling and the different tribes and everything. And I mean, this is just, again, it's part of their culture, So it really gets down to like the closest thing we can come is Hatfields and McCoys, and that doesn't hold a candle to what they to how they see things culturally, right? I think that and again, I topped out as a Sergeant E5 and then skipped all the way up to the strategic level position. So overall, totality of circumstances with my career, I'm still at the bottom of the totem pole on things. So just one guy's, opinion from the fringe geopolitically is, I feel like our presence in Afghanistan did make Afghanistan better. That you could see it in the physical infrastructure and the opportunities and education and things like that. We were helping to improve the lives of Afghans quite a bit, and opening the doors of opportunity for more progress. I think we made Iraq worse. I think Iraq was kind of stuck in the 70s, early 80s as far as technology and education and all this other stuff. And again, I remember the shock on my face and the other soldiers' faces the first time we drove through Baghdad and passed by an amusement park that looked just like one you would see here. Again, a little dated, that the perception that we have from movies and popular media and stuff was just totally different. That we realized, be like, man, that we could be in Texas or California right now, legit, and we're right downtown Baghdad. That I think we took a country that was hovering at 70s, 80s, clean water, electricity, access to healthcare and things like that, and we kind of drop kicked them back to the Stone Age. And then now, did we have the opportunity to kind of rebuild them? Yes. Was that harder because of the insurgency, the local warlords, whatever? Obviously, yes. If everybody had just sat back and been like, all right, come in and build things and we'll help and whatever, sure, you could have elevated that right back up and beyond, right? Yeah. But yeah, I feel like geopolitically, hindsight 2020, looking back, I was like, man, we did a lot of damage there, but we did improve Afghanistan, and that was, and a lot of those, I guess my theories, my baseless, unfounded opinion, a little bit supported by interactions that I have with locals and their perception as well, and yeah, it's a shame what happened with the withdrawal, because I think that a lot more progress could have been made.
When you're in Afghanistan, is there you ever give any thought to that day in September 2001? That's where it was
yes.
planned.
Yes. a lot of thought to that and subsequent days because we used to say we don't have 10 years of, at the time that I was there, 2010 timeframe, we used to say we don't have 10 years of experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have 1 year of experience 10 times over. Because it seemed like every time you handed things over, there's always a learning curve. As best a person did with handing you all the lessons learned that they had, it would still take you months to really get up to speed on it. And then by the time you really have an understanding and you're really able to positively affect things, then you have to start shutting down and handing off to somebody else. And a lot of people that would come in for those handovers a lot of people kind of came in with an attitude of being like, well, you guys didn't know what you're doing. I'm the best trained, I'm the smartest, I know what right looks like, so I'm going to do a better job than you guys. So it really was. It was 1 year at a time, kind of repeating that same year versus 10 years of experience. That a lot of the civilians, contractors and stuff, were there to bridge that gap because you had some that were literally there for 3, 4, 5 years straight sometimes, but only as much as people were willing to listen to them and take it to heart. The frustrating thing, and this was true in Iraq, it was true in Afghanistan, is the chain of command, and this is not pinpointing one particular level, okay? In my experience, regardless of the level of chain of command, they were very seldom open to hearing what they didn't want to hear or the reality of the situation. With that, even if they were, there wasn't really anything they could do about it. So again, even when you had a good chain of command that you said, hey boss, this is the problem we're facing here, and they were like, good job, 100% agree with you. Can we change our tactics and everything to deal with that problem differently? Nope, no we cannot, So it was frustrating to hear one of my interpreters in Afghanistan was 14 years old fighting the Mujahideen, or fighting with the Mujahideen against the Russians, and was effective enough at it, using the tactics of hiding in Pakistan, crossing the border and attacking the Russians in Afghanistan, running back to Pakistan, that he was eventually targeted by the Russians specifically as an individual. So his family got him out, and he actually wound up in Seattle, Washington, of all places. So here I'm growing up, and he's living there, you know what I mean, at 2 different times. When he got the opportunity to come back to Afghanistan and help his country, he jumped at it. So he gave me a lot of good insight into the tactics that they used very successfully, and the people that the U.S. was fighting in Afghanistan were using the exact same tactics. Yeah. We couldn't go into Pakistan, and they knew it. So they would wait in Pakistan, they'd come into Afghanistan, do their operations, they'd go back to Pakistan. And from his perspective, from his knowledge of what was going on, if you look at the history of the conflict, Pakistan was helping us to identify high-value targets or insurgent members, etc. The way he explained it to me was, if you were Mujahideen, you were involved in operations against the U.S., and then you went and hid in Pakistan, you were welcomed like a hero. If you kept going back into Afghanistan and conducting operations and coming back to Pakistan, you were treated like a hero and you were protected. Right. If you conducted operations against the U.S. in Afghanistan and went back to Pakistan and stayed, then eventually they would say, well, you're not helping the cause, so then you would be one of the people that would get turned over to coalition forces. And again, I don't have the burden that people higher up in the chain of command have of also knowing what I know and not being able to do anything about it. I knew I couldn't do anything about that at my level, definitely. I can't change foreign policy or tactics or anything at my level. I can't even hope for that. I feel for those that have the burden of being in a position that might have been able to influence some of that stuff, maybe use that career-ending uh-oh card, oops, sorry, accidentally let that happen, I'm glad I'm not carrying that burden on my shoulders of being able to make the decision that could have made a difference on some of those things and, going one way or the other.
All right, a couple more questions for you. How do you, looking back on your time, how do you think that's affected your life, your time, particularly in combat, both in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think that I think it's affected it both positively and negatively. The negative effects I was completely unaware of for the longest time. I think it affected it positively. I was always drawn to a life of service and military, etc. It was actually how I found my way into law enforcement. I wanted to go to Iraq and Afghanistan every single time. I've been to Iraq twice. I've been to Afghanistan 2 or 3 times at least. I think 3. And yeah, one of the trips to Afghanistan, I can't really go into details about. That was on the counter-narco-terrorism side. When there was definitely more, I saw more action, from Iraq, I remember it was never any of the, looking back on it, sorry, I've got a million thoughts running through my head all at the same time. So positive things. I had always been drawn to that life of service. And like a lot of young guys, I wanted to test myself. I grew up on the old war movies and all the stuff. Those are my heroes. I'm never really into football and stuff. Military history, all that kind of stuff. Wanted to soldier and got the opportunity to, and loved every minute of it, even the bad days. Wouldn't trade them. It definitely gave me the experience that I was looking for and that enabled me to pass on those experiences to newer generations. I think you asked the question, like, what did I think being in Afghanistan, or did I ever think back to 9/11? And I definitely did the first time that I was in the chow hall eating by myself and some other people kind of sat around and I just struck up a conversation. Everybody seemed like they were a little lonely and homesick. And we were all talking about where we were in 9/11, and everybody at the table was at one military base or another, and then we turned to a young specialist who was in water purification as an MOS, and she said, I was in elementary school. That gave a different perspective to how long I'd been going overseas and fighting the war. It was positive because I got the experiences I wanted out of it that I was able to pass on and share with other people to help them, to include the experiences I didn't want. The negative side effect is the things that I brought back that made it hard to transition back were not things that I ever would have thought. And my first thought was, it's, PTSD, all this other kind of stuff, be like, I was never in anything that serious. Everything I was involved with, even the chapters that I can't go into details about, it was stuff you've seen in the movies, whatever. I'd done search and rescue, I'd seen dead bodies before, whatever. I'm like, I'm fine. And I didn't realize how long it would take me to fully come back from being over there, if that makes sense. And I still give her credit every single day that my wife put up with me because I thought I was fine. And it took from the last time that I went in, I think 2011, it took me, I think, 5 or 6 years to recognize and be like, wow, I'm fully home. And I actually did talk to a couple of guys. I ended up talking to this guy who, chief warrant officer in the military, and then gotten out and become a counselor. And he and I, just a sit-down conversation like this, he told me a couple things that really hit home, and I didn't realize how much had been affecting me. And again, it wasn't what I thought. It was thinking back on it. It wasn't even people shooting at me at RPGs like you could just about reach out and touch coming between vehicles or something. There was a bus stop on the main base in Iraq on Bayap. And I used to go and wait for that bus to take me around the base to work every morning. And one morning I walked out and there was a huge hole in the ground and it was full of water and there was a broken pipe and everything. And I'm like, are they building, like I thought they were building an actual bus stop for us, right? And they were like, no, remember that rocket that hit last night, hit right here. And that was the one, thinking back, didn't bother me at all at the time, but then thinking back, all the other close calls that I had was like, that was the one that actually bugged me. It was like, well, I stand right here every morning, you know, and that's where I get off the bus at night. I mean, like any change, 5 or 6 minutes, who knows? And then the meat markets, literally in Iraq, goat heads. You'd go, the butchers would be out there literally chopping meat, and there would be goat heads just hanging on these stalls, in the marketplace, and just blood running down this, down the ditch, I guess, basically. That one, if I ever have bad dreams or something, that's usually in it. And then I remember driving through Iraq, first deployment, and I'm all like, hey, here to change the world, right? And I had been studying the language, the culture, all this stuff, and I remember driving by and seeing this group of guys sitting on the side of the road. There was a U-shaped apartment building and just a trench, a hand-dug trench running from the apartment building probably 100 yards to the street. And these guys are sitting on either side of this little trench, and it's just kind of raw sewage coming out, dirt trench. And across the street is an auto shop with some actual like backhoe excavators, like it was kind of a fix everything kind of auto shop, And I remember driving by and talking to the interpreter later, and I'm like, one of those, these guys are just sitting there all day. Because they were there when we drove by, they were there when we came back, and they said, yeah, that is one of the cultural differences. They're like, they know they need jobs, they know they need to do something, but they basically sit there, and if they get a job, it's the will of Allah. And it's that, those subtle cultural differences from California is if you get in a taxi and the taxi driver's driving and gets into an accident, it's your fault. Because if you hadn't flagged him down as the fare, then he wouldn't have been at that place in that time. You know what I mean? Yeah. Those are some of the subtle differences. But I thought that, and I thought, the Romans were here and had like indoor plumbing without excavators and stuff like that. Like, we're here risking our lives. It'd be nice for you guys to help out a little bit. We'll show you. You know what I mean? Carrying those things around was actually what led me to the police department, which was actually my therapy. And I don't know anybody else that's done it, and I can't explain it, but I got a master's degree, IT, program management, making lots of money, so I should be happy, and I was not. And a recruiter called me and was like, hey, have you ever thought about becoming a cop? And I was like, no. But I thought back to Gandhi's quote of be the change you want to see in the world, right? My sister, Seattle, kind of a hippie, she had that on her wall, and I'd been staring at it for the last year or two. And I thought, you know what? Yeah, there's some things I'd like to see changed, and I guess I'm going to have to do it myself. So I took an $80,000 a year pay cut. And again, my wife was nice enough to stay with me because I was like, hey, I can become a cop or get a sports car, you know, midlife crisis. And she was like, I love sports cars. So settled that argument, became a cop, and it was actually the best therapy that I could have asked for. It really helped me come home and be here with my family, with everybody else. And the positive, the negative was I realized like just kind of how grumpy and standoffish, and I didn't want to go to public events and stuff like that. I became a cop, and it was like night and day difference. I was like, sure, let's go to DC, let's go to the zoo. I don't care, you know what I mean? Like just night and day difference. So I recognized that negative side. So I'm like, God, thank God my wife put up with me being just a miserable, grumpy, antisocial bastard for the last several years. You know what I mean? But yeah, she stuck it out. I appreciate it. But it took me a while to get home. Being a cop actually helped me make that transition. And those positive lessons that I learned, the experience that I did take away from some of those gunfights, from some of those, I guess, life and death situations, helped me deal with life and death situations as a cop differently than I saw some of the other guys. And so they were able to kind of learn from me, get my perspective on it. It allowed me extra time, if that makes sense. There were certain situations where, because of what I'd been through, I was able to take the extra time to change the outcome of a situation that I think the other guys without those life and death situations didn't have that tool in their toolkit, you know. So those were some of the positive outcomes of it. It's a trade-off. My family and I and some of my friends have had to suffer some of those negative effects, but then some other people have been the beneficiaries of what that enables you to do.
You note the irony of what you just said. Most people become cops, become irritable, antisocial bastards. And you became a cop to get away from that.
I know. Hey, I never said there was nothing wrong with me, you know, I just, yeah.
Last question for you. Someone watches this interview in 50 years from now. What advice would you give that young person that's considering military service?
Oh, jeez. Man. No, know your reasons and do it for the right reasons, all right? Do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, not for what it's going to get you. It was one of the things that turned me off about the military is I busted my ass to be the perfect soldier, thinking that it would create opportunities for me, and then I'd get into this school that I was really, really trying to get to, and then I'd see somebody else in that school who was the unit screw-up from where I'd come from. And I realized, well, yeah, the reason he got to school is because the chain of command knows him because he was always in trouble. You know, they never knew me because I was never in trouble, you know, so looking back at what the meritocracy is supposed to be in the military, what it's not, the complete randomness of just, you know, you're in the right place at the right time and get this amazing opportunity, and it might be something you want to do your whole life and never get that opportunity. Make sure you're there for the right reasons, which I think are the intrinsic reasons that you can't put a value or a price on. It's not, I'm going to get this training, because that was the other thing. I thought, oh, the military will teach me to do anything. You got to come with a certain amount of talent. You can fail out of anything in the military. You know, they make it as easy as possible, but if you don't have a certain amount of talent, they're not going to push you across that finish line. You got to push yourself, you know. So yeah, go in with eyes wide open, go in with the reason, make sure it's the right reason. And I always found, you know, we had the Army values, you know, loyalty, duty, respect, honor, all this kind of stuff. A lot of guys interpreted that as, you know, hey, you got to be loyal to me. You know, if I get in trouble, you got to have my back. And I'm like, well, but if you're always getting in trouble, it's getting us in trouble. You're not being very loyal to us. You know what I mean? But the units that I was part of, the actions that we were part of, they had bigger, longer lasting meaning than those individuals. So I put my loyalty towards the unit, toward the mission, toward the ideal, and it never let me down. Didn't always turn out the way I wanted, but it never let me down.
Good. Well, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, thank you for sitting down and talking to us. Very interesting story.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for your service. Goes as a cliche sometimes, but it's meaningful.
Thank you.
Thank you.